Test, test. I think it's live now. But for whatever reason, it just doesn't want to stay. I'll just leave it up here and not stick. Okay. We'll try it one more time. We know this one is live, don't we? All right, Philippians Chapter One. I want to raise a couple of questions as I did a week ago. As you've continued to read through this book, I have picked up the pace a little bit in covering this book. I realized we had kind of going verse by verse, had kind of slowed down a pretty good bit. So over the last couple of weeks, I've tried to get the thought of a couple of paragraphs across, and so we'll try that again this evening. How many of you in your mind or maybe on your wall at home in your office have a little motto for your life? Let me give you a starter. Some people would say, I live for football. Okay? For you, what would you put in that blank? I live for what or whom? Any thoughts? How many of you live for your grandchildren? You ever seen a t-shirt that says, I live for vacation? I've seen a few of those before, okay? I live for my favorite hobby or whatever that is, okay? So I'm asking you tonight to settle in your mind the answer to this question. I live for blank. What is the purpose of your life? What is the very essence of your life? How do you view your living? Okay. Everybody got that in their head? Got your answer? Don't have to say it out loud. Okay. Now, how many of you like approaching uncomfortable subjects? Raise your hand. You just love uncomfortable subjects. Okay. The Bible speaks an awful lot about this next question I'm going to ask you, but it seems as though we as humans, we just try to do what when it comes up? We don't like to think about it. We don't like to talk much about it. Certainly don't want to dwell on it. But the Bible has too much to say about us, about it, for those of us who are Christians to avoid the matter. Okay? All right. What are your thoughts when you think about your dying? The first question had to do with your what? Your living, right? And so the next question has to do with what are your thoughts as you think about your dying, the act of death when it comes to you. I'm saying that probably not many of us like to dwell on that too long, do we? Okay. And so I raise those two questions because if you focused very much on the few verses that are next in line for us in Philippians 1, The very first verse we look at this evening, where we left off last week, is verse 21, where Paul says, "For to me to live is Christ." That's what goes in his blank. Okay? And then he says, "And to die is" what? Gain. Now, from a contextual standpoint, why does Paul say this in verse 21? These, by the way, are some of the most quoted words by the Apostle Paul. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Those are quoted probably more in number than many other things of all of Paul's writing. In the context, why would he say that? What is the last few words in verse 20? What are they? What are the last few words in verse 20? What's he saying? Whether I live or I die, what do I want to happen? That Christ be exalted or magnified in my what? Body. And then he says, whether by life or by what? Death. Okay? So life and death here is under consideration by the apostle, who, by the way, is incarcerated. He's in an imprisonment. He refers to his chains that he's bound by already in this letter that we've already in this letter that we've studied. There we go. Okay. And so with that, he comes to verse 21, having brought up the subject already, and he says, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is" what? Gain. Now, I want us to look at a few passages together, if you will. The first one that comes to my mind when I read those words, Galatians chapter 2. Turn there with me, Galatians chapter 2. Let's see if we can get inside the mind of Paul just a little bit to understand why in chains, all he cares about is Christ is preached. That's in Philippians 1. The thing that he takes great joy in is the furtherance of the gospel by his imprisonment. Okay? And then the third thing down at verse 20 that we looked at had to do with what? Whether I live or die, what do I want most of all, in essence? And that is for Christ to be exalted or magnified, whether in my death or in my life. So how could he say, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain? Verse 20 of Galatians 2, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Anybody ever heard that verse before? Okay? So notice what he says. When he says, I have been crucified with Christ, what he is actually saying is that I have died with Christ. When we are baptized, what do? Romans chapter 6, verses 3 and 4, we die, don't we? And we are buried with him by baptism into death, are the words in Romans 6, verse 3 and 4. Okay? And so first, for us to be with Paul, that same mindset, for me to live as Christ, I have to first be crucified with Christ. A little later on in this Galatian letter, you get to chapter 6 and verse 14, and talking about himself, he says, God forbid that I should boast except in the cross of Jesus Christ my Lord, talking about this very crucifixion. Then he says this, by whom the world has been crucified to me, and I have been crucified to the world. In other words, the world and the things of this world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, 1 John 2:15 and following, all that's dead to me. And as far as those things are concerned, I'm dead to them. We're not in compatible agreement anymore because I've been crucified with Christ. Okay? So when your eyeballs come back to Galatians 2 and verse 20, After he says, I've been crucified with Christ, in other words, I've been put to death with Christ, he says, so it is no longer I who live, but now who lives in him. So does it make more sense, Philippians 1:21, our verse, for me to live is what, church? Christ. Why? He had crucified his own affections and lust, his own self-will, all of that when he was baptized into Christ. And now he didn't see his life as his anymore, but who was living in him? Jesus Christ was. And that's not just true of Paul because he was an apostle. That's true of Paul because he was a Christian. Okay? Is it true that Christ lives in us? It is very much true that Christ lives in us. Okay? Look with me. Let's go a little further back to the left in your page, turning to Romans. Romans chapter 14. Another statement made by Paul in another letter. But let's see if it has any bearing here. Beginning at verse 7, and we'll read down through verse 9. Romans 14, 7, 8, and 9. For none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord. And if we die to whom? The Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are whose? The Lord's. Now, obviously, he's talking about Christians here. He's writing to the church at Rome. Verse 9. For to this end, you could translate that, for this very purpose, Christ died and rose and lived again, that he might be both the Lord of the dead and the what? The living. Okay? So, whenever an individual, as Paul's talking about, whether I live, it'll be Christ that lives. Whether I die, well, that's gain to me. Why? Because the same Lord is Lord of me whether or not I'm living or whether or not I have what? I've died. I'm dead. Okay? He understands that. Now, is that faith? Someone has said the truest test of faith is at death. That'll show when we really trust the Lord. We don't have but one more breath left in our body. That'll be the test. Do we still trust the Lord then, that he's going to do as he promised to do with those who are saved by the blood of Christ? That's a strong thought, but that is a great test of our faith. It is at the point of death. All right, now come to 2 Corinthians 5, and then I'm going to open it up maybe for some of your thoughts. 2 Corinthians 5. And so as we discuss death, do we sometimes kind of feel morbid? Do we? That's a morbid thought, isn't it? Okay. But at the same time, did Paul have a negative, morbid type, dreadful thought of death as a Christian? He didn't have it, did he? Okay, come down to 2 Corinthians 5 and look at verse 6. We'll begin there. So we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body. If you go back earlier in those verses, look at verse 1. What was he talking about? Home in the body. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent or tabernacle, if it is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Okay? So he's talking about the physical body, this temporary tent for the soul, for the spirit. Okay? So verse 6, we're always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, while we're here, we are absent from whom? The Lord. Verse 7, for we walk by what? Faith, and not by sight. We are confident, yes, well pleased rather, to be absent from the body, and then to be present with whom? The Lord. So what was Paul's thought? What did he look forward to? Which is very obvious here. He's not saying I don't want to live another second. He's not saying I do not enjoy the relationships I have come to have in this life. That is not his thought. But what is he saying? What was his number one goal and vision in life? Where was he aiming? To be with the Lord one day, right? Okay. So I hope all of those thoughts, come back to Philippians 1 now, if you will, with me, helps us understand. I want to read 21, 22, 23, and 24, just to kind of pull this together and then get some of your thoughts maybe. For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. For I'm hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. Now let's just put a marker there. When you have read this book through a few times, how many of you are kind of scratching your head a little bit as to what Paul is actually doing here? Have you thought that he kind of says one thing and then he comes back and says, well, no, this could happen. I really don't know what's going to happen. Because I mention all that because when you get to verse 25, he says, and being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. So what does he mean earlier about if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor, yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. What's Paul trying to say in that verse? All right, so on one level, what Paul wanted in his mind is still yet superseded by what was needed by these early Christians in the Philippian church, okay? All right. What does he mean by that little expression you think at the end of 22? Yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. Was it up to Paul? Paul get to make the choice here about whether he stayed or whether or not through this imprisonment he would be a martyr for Christ? Did he get to choose? In the original language, here's what it appears to be. He is saying, I have these two things in my mind, okay? Do I want to go on and be with the Lord? Well, sure. That's what his goal had been. That's what we looked at in those other verses, right? And can you imagine one day, after all the grief and sorrow and toil and whatever persecution we may have faced here because of our faith, the hardships of life, that you ever heard the song, Heaven Will Surely Be Worth It All, okay? And so on one side of Paul's brain, you might say that's a prevailing thought. That's something that keeps entering in. But then on the other side, he says what? In 2 Corinthians 11, I think it's about verse number 28, Paul mentions several things that he had suffered for Christ. But then about verse 28, I think it is, he mentions, and the least of all of these, or not the least of all these, would be the care for all the churches. So as Paul thought about how much more teaching, training, example, spiritual building up that these early Christians needed, that's why he would later say what? But to stay here is more what? Needful for you, okay? But that last expression, what I choose, I cannot tell, what he's saying is, I'm not going to reveal to you, this is how it comes across in the Greek, okay? What I would choose between the two, going on and being with the Lord or staying here for you, I cannot tell. In other words, I'm not going to reveal that to you. It's not that he doesn't necessarily know which one he would choose. It's just the fact that there was no need of him telling them what it is that he would rather do. Brother Pro? Yeah. And it may well be too, I choose not to tell you what I'm doing, but at the end of the day, even if I was given that choice, Which, did Paul understand this choice was not his? If there was anybody that understood the sovereignty of God and whatever God wanted to happen in his life was going to happen, how many times did Paul want to go somewhere and do something, but the Spirit said, no, no, you're going over here? Acts 16, how the church at Philippi got started, just one of those instances, okay? But he understood God's purpose for his life, and all this would be in God's hands. By the way, not Caesar's hands, not from some higher court of Rome, okay? He understood who was on top of them, okay? Who's ahead of them all, who's in charge of them all, okay? And so that's kind of what you get there. By the way, in verse 22, just if you're interested, that second phrase after he says, but if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. That's really taken from one Greek word, ergon, and it was highly used by Paul all through the book of Acts as he spoke about going from one city to the next. All right. For instance, did Paul consider preaching and carrying the gospel from one place to another the work and his work and the work of God? Did he consider that labor? Yes. Did he also work laboring with his own hands as a tent maker to help make a living where he went, so people wouldn't accuse him of preaching just for the sake of getting money like y'all do me? Okay? Just kidding. I know you. Okay. So yeah, he would do that. And in those days, it was very important for him to do that, or those first efforts at preaching the gospel could have been skewed. You understand that? He wanted everybody to understand this is as pure a message. I'm not preaching it for any other reason other than its truth. Okay? Okay, so come down to verse 23. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. And that's the way it reads in the original. Matter of fact, it says it's better than the best. That's the best alternative. Now, we may not always think about that right now, do we? We have plans. We have things we want to do. We have people we want to continue to see. But Paul understood that to go on to be with Christ was far, far better, is how it reads in his actual letter that he penned. That was his number one. That's the goal. That was the goal. Okay? What does it mean to be hard pressed between the two? It's hard to make the decision. I think, is it the King James that says, I am in a strait betwixt or between two things? And a strait, of course, like in Matthew 7:13 and 14, where Jesus is talking about, enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, broad is the way. But that word straight there doesn't have a GH in it, does it? Okay? And neither does it here, if I'm not mistaken here, okay? So he's not talking about something that's a straight line. A strait was something that would be used mainly by people who traveled, especially people who were sea vessel goers. They were captains of ships. And a lot of times when you'd be going to a place that had land that was pretty tight together and water passed between, or a couple of bodies of water coming together at one impasse, it would be very, very difficult to pass through what they were describing there as a what? As a strait, okay? And by the way, the word strait really could be translated difficult, okay? It's going to be hard, okay? And so when he says here, I'm in a strait, is he saying this is some flimsy, whimsical thought? No, this is a hard matter. But at the end of the day, what did he realize? It's not up to me. It is simply up to the Lord. The word depart in verse 23 could sometimes, and I love sharing this with you, and if you don't appreciate it, you can tell me. I won't cry. But I told you Sunday night that I love the way that the Holy Spirit used words from the Greek-speaking world of their day that were already being used in other contexts of life. This language wasn't created just so they could write the New Testament, okay? They took a language that was already being well spoken by the masses, and from the usage in certain places, then they employed that when they're trying to explain Scripture. Okay? And so the beautiful thing about that word depart, it would be used after, for instance, a military encampment had come together. They're waiting to go to war, but the time is not right yet, or they're waiting on the morning so they can arise and go. But finally, when that military is deployed, the word from which we get depart right here would have been that word they used in the Greek world back then. Okay? So it was, in other words, it was a time to what? Leave one place and to be set on course for another. And when he says to depart and to be with Christ, it was also a term that was a nautical term, talking about those captains and sailors of ships back then, for when you would be either departing from the what? Maybe from the harbor. And sometimes it was used after a vessel had been in use for months, that it was time for it to depart from its goings and do what? Maybe return back to the harbor. And so Paul here is using that particular word that was well known by the Christians in that day. All right, let's try to make a little commentary on verse 24, and that'll give us 24 through 26. To remain in the flesh, more needful for you. If you would write down Acts 20, 18 through 35. Acts 20, 18 through 35. That gives you a comparison with the church at Ephesus, and it shows you the things that the early church was in need of. When he says it's more needful for me to stay here, that's when he calls the elders of the church at Ephesus to him, and he teaches them more, but he also warns them about those who will what? Wolves will come in from among your own selves in sheep's clothing to draw away disciples after themselves. So why was it needful for the church at Philippi for Paul to stay around? And as he mentions in verse 25, I'm confident of this. I know that I shall remain and continue with you for the progress of your joy and faith. So not only did he believe, now did he know this for sure? But it's what he believes. A lot of commentary on this, that he won't be put to death this time. This is in about AD 62. He would be put to death in his second Roman imprisonment 5 years later, okay, after it. And so the idea here is, well, how did Paul know this? Did the Holy Spirit give him some insight? Okay. Did he see a bit? We're just not told. Look in chapter 2 and come down to verse 17 and see if Paul is just a little still unsure as to what's going to happen. Yes, and if I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. So does it sound like Paul's still holding out? It is possible that I die after this imprisonment. Kind of sounds like it, okay? But he's put his faith and trust in God, and he's certainly hoping, because it's needful for them, that he'll be able to remain and carry on teaching and helping them grow in the faith. Look at what his goal is as far as they are concerned at the end of verse 25. I want to remain with you for your what? Progress and joy of what? Of faith. Isn't that the same reason that you and I keep meeting together as we do? Isn't that the same reason we continue to study and exhort and admonish one another? It should be. That's what Paul had in mind whenever he was able to go back and to be with them. Verse 26, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. They'll have more to be thankful of and for in Jesus regarding his being able to come and teach them further and be with them and help their faith to be strengthened. All right, so what do we get from this section, 21 through 26? What are some takeaways? What do you get from this text? Our mission is to glorify Christ, isn't it? Up until this point, and I'll say it again, I mentioned it earlier in the lesson, but he was okay with being in prison because it allowed for the furtherance of what? The gospel. Okay? He didn't mind other people preaching out of ill will to try to increase the affliction of his own chains, as long as who was being preached, as long as Christ is being preached. Okay? He's okay whether he goes on living or if he's put to death, because whether he lives or he dies, who will be exalted or magnified in his body? Christ. Those are three keys. Okay? If you want to know how Paul was able to continue on being faithful to Christ even through all of this difficult stuff that he went through, it's because of those three attitudes he had. Okay, about Christ being preached, the gospel being spread. He knew he was just a vessel. He's just a tool in order to make that happen. Okay, and after he was gone, there would be others that God would raise up, I believe was his thought. Okay, other takeaways from this. Mm-hmm. That's it. And even if I die, Christ will be magnified, and the overall purpose that was the purpose of Christ in me will have still been achieved. Okay, very good. What else? What do you take away from this passage tonight? Yeah, yeah. That boldness, that confidence. He had no fear, Mr. Danny said, even for his own life, as long as he was preaching and teaching this message of Jesus Christ. All right. Say something about death. Do you have your hand up? All right. You just bought an automobile. All right. Oh, yeah. Should a Christian look at death the same way for themselves as maybe the rest of the world? Mm-mm. And why is that? That hope, you know, that hope of departing from here and being with Christ. Don't forget those words, which is far better. Paul wasn't demeaning the life God had given him by saying that. Paul wasn't saying, I don't love the people that I've come into contact with in and out of Christ. He wasn't saying any of that. But what he's saying is, who is the most important one in his life? It was Jesus. Do you remember when Paul wasn't in this company, the 11 apostles at that time was, the Great Commission? Matthew chapter 28, 19 and 20. Go ye into all the world and what? Well, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. What was the last statement? And lo, I am with you. Now, is the Lord with us as long as we live for him? He lives in us, Galatians 2:20. But here what Paul is talking about, yes, I know Christ is with me, but I am ready if God so sees fit that it's time, I'm ready now to go and be with him. That makes sense? He's with us as we live for him, so that hopefully we're living our lives that when that time comes for us, whenever it may be, that we've got our hearts, our eyes, our minds set on being with him. I'm telling you, I have changed my whole thinking about my life, my preaching, all in about the last 3 to 4 weeks just from studying this first chapter. When you get a good inside look at Paul's words here, I think it is transforming, maybe to if we've not had this mindset before. Okay, we're going to take just a quick little intermission. and then we'll have a devotional message that Chase will bring to us, and then Ray has an invitation song, I think, after that. So let's just hold tight just a second till all of our teens get over here, and then we'll have our brief invitation. I want you to think for just a moment about where your relationship with the Lord is. Is it on track? Is it where it needs to be? Not long ago, I was extending an invitation after some lesson. I don't remember how long ago it's been, but nonetheless, I said, is it where you want it to be? I got in the truck on the way home, and I thought about that for a little while. And I said, that may not be the question to be asked. The question to be asked is our relationship with the Lord where it needs to be? Some people have exactly the relationship with Christ they want, but it's not necessarily the one the Lord wants. If you have a need to respond tonight, we hope that you'll come. If you are a Christian and you just need prayers for strength or want to confess sins, and all of us pray for you, go to God's throne on your behalf. We're happy to do that. And if you are someone not yet a Christian, if you want to learn what to do to become one, please let us know. Come right now as we stand and as we sing together.